The rain in Seattle always had a way of washing the color out of the world, leaving behind only grayscale truths. Matthew sat in his idling car, watching the red tail lights of his wife's Volvo disappear into the underground garage of the Meridian, a luxury building miles away from her office at Pemberton Tech. She had texted him an hour ago. Working late, dead battery soon, going silent. Love you. It was a perfect, ordinary lie. But as Matthew watched her emerge from the garage and walk into the dimly lit lobby, a man stepped out of the shadows. She didn't just greet him, she melted against his chest with a desperate familiarity that shattered Matthew's reality in an instant. The silence she promised wasn't about a dead battery. It was the sound of a hidden life locking its doors. If stories of deeply buried secrets, the suffocating weight of betrayal, and the agonizing journey of discovering who you are truly married to speak to your soul, stay with me. This is just the beginning of the end. The rain in Seattle didn't fall. It hung in the air like a cold, miserable mist, coating the windshield of Matthew Collins' sedan in a permanent blur. The rhythmic, monotonous thud of the wiper blades did little to clear his vision, nor did it quiet the frantic drumming of his own heartbeat. His knuckles were bone white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes locked on the sleek silver Volvo 3 car lengths ahead. Evelyn's car. Working late, dead battery soon, going silent. Love you. The text message, received exactly 42 minutes ago, felt like a physical weight in his chest. It was the same message she had sent 3 times in the last month, always on a Thursday, always accompanied by the faint smell of jasmine and rain when she finally crawled into bed past midnight, her skin cold, her eyes avoiding his. Matthew hadn't planned to follow his wife. He had told himself he was just bringing her a coffee, a surprise to break the monotony of her late-night grind at Pemberton Tech. But when he saw her Volvo bypass the highway exit for the corporate park and head toward the affluent, shadowy streets of Capitol Hill, the coffee in his cup holder grew cold, and a sickening certainty settled in his stomach. The Volvo's turn signal flashed, a mocking wink of amber in the gloom, as it descended into the subterranean parking garage of the Meridian. It was a luxury apartment complex known for its discreet entrances and exorbitant rent, a place completely disconnected from their suburban life, from their 7-year marriage, from Lakeside School where their daughter was currently at a sleepover. Matthew parked his car on the wet street opposite the building, the engine idling with a low hum that vibrated through the floorboards. He rolled the window down an inch. The damp chill bit into his face, but he needed the air. He needed to breathe, to convince himself that he was overreacting, that she was here for a client meeting, a secret project, anything but the cliché that had been tearing his sanity apart piece by piece. He waited. 5 minutes. 10. Then she appeared. Evelyn walked out of the glass-paneled lobby, protected from the drizzle by the building's massive awning. She looked stunning, not the exhausted, overworked mother he knew, but vibrant, electric. She was wearing the trench coat he had bought her for their anniversary, the belt pulled tight around her waist. A man stepped out from the shadows near the concrete pillar. He was taller than Matthew, wearing a dark wool coat, his posture relaxed, almost predatory. Matthew's breath caught in his throat. He waited for the handshake, the professional nod, the exchange of documents. Instead, the man reached out and traced the line of Evelyn's jaw. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. Evelyn leaned into the touch, her eyes closing as if she had been wandering in a desert and had finally found water. The man stepped closer, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her flush against his chest. When he kissed her, it wasn't a stolen, frantic act of lust. It was slow, deep, devastatingly familiar. It was the kiss of a couple who had a history, a language spoken entirely in the spaces between their bodies. In the driver's seat of his car, Matthew felt the world fracture. The sound of the rain faded into a deafening static. He watched his wife, the woman who had vowed her life to him, the mother of his child, bury her face in a stranger's neck, breathing him in. She had gone silent, just like she promised. But the silence wasn't a dead phone. It was the heavy, soundless collapse of a 7-year lie. Matthew didn't scream. He didn't hit the steering wheel. He simply sat in the cold, gray dark, watching the ghost of his marriage walk arm in arm into the elevator of the Meridian, leaving him behind in the wreckage. The drive back to Oakwood Estates was a sensory void. Matthew Collins navigated the familiar, winding suburban roads on pure muscle memory, his mind tethered to the image of the silver Volvo and the man in the dark wool coat. When he finally pulled into their driveway, the house looked exactly as he had left it. A pristine, two-story colonial with warm porch lights cutting through the Seattle dampness. It was the architectural embodiment of a successful marriage. Now it just looked like a beautifully dressed stage waiting for its lead actress. He did not turn on the lights in the living room. Instead, Matthew sat in the leather wingback chair in the corner, enveloped in the shadows, nursing a glass of bourbon he had poured but hadn't tasted. The silence of the house was absolute, save for the rhythmic, metallic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. At exactly 1:15 in the morning, the heavy deadbolt clicked. The front door opened, letting in a gust of wet, biting wind before clicking shut. Matthew remained perfectly still in the dark. He heard the familiar rustle of fabric. Evelyn taking off the trench coat, the soft thud of her heels being kicked off by the entryway bench. A heavy theatrical sigh of exhaustion meant for an empty hallway. "Matt," she called out softly, noticing the faint glow of the street lamp catching the amber liquid in his glass. She walked into the living room, pausing as her eyes adjusted to the gloom. She looked tired, the flawless makeup from earlier now slightly smudged, her shoulders slumped. It was a masterpiece of domestic fatigue. If Matthew hadn't been parked across the street from the Meridian 3 hours ago, he would have rushed to her, offered to massage her shoulders, and drawn her a hot bath. "Hey," Matthew said. His voice sounded detached, echoing slightly in his own ears, as if someone else were speaking. "You're late." Evelyn moved toward him, the faint rustle of her silk blouse loud in the quiet room. "I know. I'm so sorry, honey." She sank onto the arm of his chair, draping an arm around his shoulders. She pressed her lips to his temple. Matthew stopped breathing. He closed his eyes, analyzing the sensory input. He smelled the familiar jasmine of her shampoo, the damp ozone of the rain, and beneath it all, faint but unmistakable, a sharp, woody trace of bergamot and cedar. A man's cologne. It clung to her skin, a microscopic residue of a betrayal she had just brought into their home. "The server migration at Pemberton took hours longer than expected," Evelyn murmured, rubbing the back of his neck with practiced affection. "The entire database almost crashed. I was practically screaming at the IT lead. I thought my phone died. I couldn't even text you after 9. Working late, dead battery soon, going silent. Love you." The script was flawless. She didn't stutter. She didn't avoid his gaze when he finally turned his head to look at her. Her eyes, reflecting the dim light, were pools of exhausted, loving sincerity. This was the most terrifying realization of the night. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't guilty. The lie came to her as naturally as breathing. "Sounds like a nightmare," Matthew said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "It was," she sighed, standing up and stretching her arms. "I'm going to take a quick shower and just collapse. Are you coming up?" "In a minute. I'm going to finish this drink." Evelyn offered him a tired, sympathetic smile. "Don't stay up too late. I love you." "Love you too." He watched her walk up the oak staircase, listening to the soft padding of her bare feet until the bedroom door clicked shut. The plumbing hummed as the shower turned on, washing away the bergamot, the cedar, and the touch of the man in the shadows. Matthew sat alone in the dark, the ice in his bourbon melting into water. He realized with a chilling clarity that the woman currently standing under the hot water in his master bathroom was a stranger. The Evelyn he knew, the devoted mother, the stressed executive, his partner of 7 years, was a ghost, and he was trapped in a haunted house, pretending he couldn't see the apparition walking right through him. The morning sun did nothing to dispel the cold that had settled deep in Matthew's bones. He sat at the kitchen island, a mug of black coffee cooling between his hands, watching Evelyn move through her morning routine with terrifying normalcy. She packed her leather tote, kissed their daughter's forehead. Lily had just been dropped off from her sleepover, blissfully unaware of the tectonic shift in her parents' universe, and gave Matthew a distracted, practiced peck on the cheek before heading out the door to Pemberton Tech. The moment the garage door rumbled shut, the house ceased to be a home. It became a crime scene, and Matthew was the lead investigator of his own ruined life. He started in the master bedroom. The air still held the faint, lingering scent of her jasmine shower gel, a cruel reminder of the intimacy they shared just hours before. He felt a sickening twist of guilt as he approached her oak dresser, a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. But the image of the man in the dark wool coat pulling her close at the meridian burned away his hesitation, replacing it with a cold, desperate need for facts. His hands trembled slightly as he sifted through silk scarves and neatly folded sweaters. Nothing. He moved to the walk-in closet, checking the pockets of the trench coat she wore last night. Empty, save for a crumpled receipt from an artisanal coffee shop near Capitol Hill, a neighborhood nowhere near her corporate office. It was a breadcrumb, but not the smoking gun he needed. Then his eyes landed on her vanity. Tucked in the back corner sat an ornate, vintage jewelry box she had inherited from her grandmother. Evelyn rarely opened it, claiming the pieces were too delicate for daily wear. Matthew unlatched the tiny silver clasp. He lifted the top tray, revealing a tangle of old pearls and tarnished silver. Beneath that was a velvet-lined bottom compartment. He pressed his fingers against the fabric, feeling a slight, unnatural lump in the back left corner. With a jagged breath, Matthew pried the velvet lining loose. Hidden beneath the false bottom was a heavy, unmarked golden key. It wasn't for their house. It wasn't for the Volvo, nor was it a standard, flimsy office key. Its intricate teeth and heavy brass weight suggested a high-end security lock. The Meridian. It had to be. He slipped the cold metal into his pocket, the physical weight of it anchoring him to the devastating reality. He needed more. He left the bedroom and walked down the hall to Evelyn's home office. She was meticulous with her digital life, always locking her work laptop, but she was occasionally careless with her personal iPad. Matthew tapped the screen, bringing it to life. He didn't bother with their shared banking apps. She was far too smart for that. Instead, he opened her personal email and typed a single word into the search bar. Meridian. Nothing. He tried again. Capitol Hill, rent, lease. A series of archived emails populated the screen. They weren't from a property management company directly, but from an automated billing system linked to an obscure LLC called Stone Holdings. Matthew's pulse hammered against his temples as he opened the most recent invoice. It was a receipt for a wire transfer, $4,000 processed on the first of every month. The billing address was listed as Unit 1402, the Meridian. Matthew stared at the screen, the glowing white light reflecting in his hollow eyes. $4,000 a month. That wasn't a hotel room for a quick, sordid affair. That was a lease, a second home, a completely parallel existence funded from a private account he didn't even know she possessed. He took the golden key out of his pocket and placed it on the glass desk, right next to the glowing iPad screen. The narrative she had spun for 7 years was unraveling thread by thread, revealing a dark, complex tapestry underneath. Evelyn wasn't just having a momentary lapse in judgment. She was living 2 lives, and Matthew had just found the key to the one she kept hidden in the dark. The name Stone Holdings glowed on the iPad screen like a radioactive isotope. Matthew transferred his investigation to his desktop computer, his fingers striking the mechanical keyboard with a frantic, rhythmic precision. The absolute silence of the suburban house pressed against his eardrums, broken only by the hum of the processor as he plunged into public records databases. It took 40 minutes to pierce the corporate veil of the obscure LLC. When the primary signatory finally loaded on the screen, the text felt like a physical blow to the sternum. Derek Stone. Matthew opened a new browser tab. He typed the name, filtering the search by Seattle, and adding keywords like real estate and consulting. A professional profile materialized, followed by a handful of high society event photos linked to a boutique investment firm. He clicked on a gallery thumbnail from a charity gala. The high-resolution image expanded, filling his monitor with a brutal clarity. It was him. The dark wool coat from last night was replaced by a tailored tuxedo, but the sharp jawline, the predatory stillness, and the heavy, arrogant gaze were unmistakable. It was the man from the subterranean garage of the Meridian. But it wasn't the man's face that made the blood freeze in Matthew's veins. It was the woman standing next to him in the photograph. Evelyn. She looked slightly younger, her hair styled differently, but the way she leaned into Derek, her hand resting flat and entirely possessive against his chest, mirrored the exact, devastating intimacy Matthew had witnessed in the rain just 12 hours ago. Matthew's eyes darted to the timestamp at the bottom of the article. Bellevue Art Gala, October 2015. 2015. A full year before Matthew ever walked into that crowded downtown jazz bar and bought a quiet, melancholic woman a drink. A year before she told him, with tears in her eyes, that she was recovering from a deeply destructive breakup that she refused to discuss. "You make me feel safe, Matt," she had whispered to him on the night he proposed, her fingers tracing the collar of his shirt. "You're my solid ground." He had worn that declaration like a medal. He believed he was the architect of her healing, the good man who had rescued her from a chaotic, painful past. Matthew stared at the photograph, the illusion of his life fracturing into jagged, irreparable pieces. The breakup had been a lie. The healing had been a performance. Derek Stone wasn't a tragic mistake born of mid-marriage boredom. He was the original foundation. Feverishly, Matthew opened another search, pulling up interstate property records. Derek Stone had relocated his primary business address from Chicago to Seattle in 2020. Year 3 of Matthew and Evelyn's marriage. It was the exact same year Evelyn had suddenly pushed for them to upgrade their lifestyle, urging Matthew to take the grueling partner track at his firm, a promotion that conveniently required him to travel out of state twice a month. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a sickening, flawless logic. The $4,000 a month, the dead batteries, the late nights. The apartment at the Meridian wasn't a secret getaway. It was a permanent sanctuary, a hidden world where Evelyn could maintain a bond she never had any intention of breaking. Matthew pushed his chair back, the wheels scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. The air in the office felt thin, refusing to fill his lungs. Every memory he held dear, their sunlit wedding day, the sterilized hospital room when Lily was born, the quiet Sunday mornings drinking coffee on the porch, was suddenly contaminated. He wasn't the protagonist of his own marriage. He was a supporting character, a financially stable, socially acceptable alibi for a woman who had belonged to a ghost from the very beginning. Thursday arrived again with the predictability of a funeral dirge. Evelyn's excuse this time was a networking dinner for women in tech. Matthew didn't argue. He simply nodded, kissed her cheek, and waited exactly 20 minutes after she left before grabbing the heavy steel binoculars he used for hiking and driving back into the city. He didn't park at the Meridian. He navigated to a municipal parking garage a block away, driving spiraling upward until he reached the exposed concrete roof. The rain had paused, leaving the Seattle skyline glittering like scattered diamonds against the bruised purple twilight. From this vantage point, looking across the narrow urban chasm, the glass facade of the Meridian was a towering grid of illuminated dioramas. Matthew stepped out of his car. The wind whipped at his coat, biting through the fabric, but he couldn't feel the cold. He raised the binoculars, his hands remarkably steady for a man whose life was ending, and began to scan the 14th floor. He found Unit 1402 easily. It was a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows, glowing with a warm amber light that stood out against the sterile blues of the surrounding apartments. Matthew adjusted the focus wheel. The blurred shapes sharpened into agonizing clarity. It wasn't a hotel room. It was a home. Bookshelves lined the walls. An expensive espresso machine sat on the kitchen counter. An abstract art hung above a velvet sofa. And there, in the center of the frame, was Evelyn. She was wearing one of Derek's oversized white button-down shirts, her bare legs tucked beneath her as she sat on the kitchen island. Derek stood between her knees. He wasn't ravishing her. He was carefully, methodically chopping vegetables on a cutting board, pausing only to feed her a piece of a bell pepper. Evelyn threw her head back and laughed. Matthew lowered the binoculars for a fraction of a second, his breath catching in a painful hitch. He hadn't seen that specific laugh, unrestrained, full-throated, entirely free, since their honeymoon. Perhaps he had never truly seen it at all. Perhaps it was a ghost he had only imagined she possessed. He forced himself to look again. He had to drink the poison to the dregs. Derek set the knife down and wiped his hands on a towel. He reached up, cupping Evelyn's face, his thumbs gently tracing her cheekbones. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his, her eyes closed in absolute serene surrender. It was a gesture of profound, quiet intimacy. It wasn't the frantic, secretive groping of an illicit affair. It was the deeply rooted comfort of a couple who had weathered storms, who knew the exact topography of each other's souls. They were the real marriage. Matthew watched as Derek poured 2 glasses of red wine, handing one to Evelyn before lifting her effortlessly off the counter. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her legs locking around his waist, burying her face in his shoulder as he carried her toward the living room, out of the window's line of sight. The apartment remained softly lit, but the stage was empty. Matthew stood on the concrete roof, the wind howling around him, the binoculars hanging heavy from his neck. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, shattering the final, desperate hope he had clung to. He could have survived a physical betrayal, a moment of weakness, a drunken mistake, a temporary thrill. Those were transgressions a marriage could potentially absorb. But this was an emotional fortress he had never been allowed to enter. Evelyn hadn't just given Derek her body, she had given him her authenticity. The woman who came home to Oakwood Estates every night, the woman who discussed mortgages and PTA meetings and retirement plans with Matthew, was merely an avatar. He wasn't fighting another man for his wife. He was fighting the reality that his wife had never truly existed. Saturday evening arrived with the delicate clinking of crystal wine glasses and the rich, savory aroma of braised short ribs. The dining room of the Oakwood Estates house was bathed in the warm, forgiving glow of a modern chandelier. To anyone peering through the front window, it was a flawless tableau of suburban success. Sarah Chen and Mike Johnson sat across the mahogany table, laughing as Mike recounted a disastrous golf outing. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, the picture of the gracious, attentive hostess. She wore a simple navy silk dress, her smile perfectly measured, her laughter hitting all the right, polite notes. Matthew sat opposite her, quietly swirling a heavy pour of Cabernet in his glass. He watched her perform. Having seen the raw, uninhibited joy on her face 2 nights ago in the Meridian, her current demeanor looked distinctly robotic. It was an impeccable counterfeit of a human being. "I don't know how you two do it," Sarah said, reaching across the table to touch Evelyn's arm affectionately. "With your promotion at Pemberton and mat-making partner, you both work insane hours. Yet you still manage to host a dinner party that looks like it belongs in a magazine." "It takes a lot of careful compartmentalization," Evelyn replied smoothly, offering a modest smile, "and a lot of late nights at the office." Matthew set his wineglass down. The bass hit the wood with a sharp, resonant thud that cut through the soft jazz playing in the background. "Compartmentalization," Matthew repeated, testing the weight of the word. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on his wife. "That's exactly the right word, isn't it? The ability to put one life in a neat little box, lock it away, and step seamlessly into another." Mike chuckled, slicing into his meat. "Sounds like the definition of corporate survival, mate." "Oh, it goes far beyond corporate life," Matthew said, his voice dropping half an octave, adopting a smooth conversational cadence that held a razor-sharp edge. "I was just reading an article the other day about the psychology of double lives, how some people can maintain an entirely parallel existence. It's fascinating, really, the sheer logistics of the deception." Evelyn's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Most people get caught because they're sloppy," Matthew continued, looking directly at Mike but projecting the words across the table like daggers. "A stray text message, a lipstick stain, amateurs. The true masters of deception don't make those mistakes. They build an entirely separate infrastructure, hidden LLCs, private bank accounts." Sarah frowned slightly, the mood in the room suddenly feeling a few degrees colder. "That's terrifying. Who has the energy for that?" "You'd be surprised what people find the energy for when they're protecting an addiction," Matthew said softly. He finally shifted his gaze from Mike, letting it lock onto Evelyn. Her eyes were wide, the polite hostess smile replaced by a rigid, perfectly still mask. "They find a sanctuary, an expensive apartment perhaps, somewhere high up with floor-to-ceiling windows, a place where they can drop the exhaustion of their fake marriage and just Be themselves. The silence that followed was absolute. The jazz music seemed to fade out. The air in the dining room turned thick and unbreathable. Matt, Evelyn said, her voice dangerously quiet, a tremor of genuine unease vibrating beneath the surface. What a morbid topic for a dinner party. Just making conversation, darling. Matthew smiled, a cold, dead expression that didn't reach his eyes. He picked up his wine glass again. I just think it's incredible what you can buy for, say, $4,000 a month. Security, discretion, the illusion of loyalty. Evelyn's hand resting on the white linen tablecloth twitched. The knuckles turned stark white. For the first time in 7 years, Matthew saw genuine panic flash in his wife's eyes. She wasn't looking at the safe, predictable man she had married. She was looking at a stranger who was slowly, deliberately burning her perfectly constructed world to the ground. The front door clicked shut, sealing Mike and Sarah out into the damp Seattle night. The silence that rushed back into the house was deafening, heavy with the unspoken words that had choked the air during dessert. Evelyn immediately moved to the dining table, her movements sharp and erratic as she began stacking the dessert plates. She didn't look at Matthew. "I'll take care of the dishwasher," she said, her voice tight, aiming for casual domesticity but missing the mark entirely. Matthew didn't move from his spot by the archway. He watched her carry the porcelain tower into the kitchen. The sound of running water echoed against the subway tile backsplash. He walked in slowly, his footsteps deliberate against the hardwood floor. "You were incredibly quiet after I brought up that article," Matthew noted, leaning against the doorframe, his hands buried deep in his pockets. Evelyn kept her back to him, furiously scrubbing a plate that was already clean. "It was an inappropriate topic for a dinner party, Matt. You made Sarah uncomfortable. You made me uncomfortable." "Did I?" He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking to a few feet, the scent of her expensive perfume mixed with the metallic tang of the tap water. "Or did I just get a little too close to the truth for your liking?" She froze, the sponge slipping from her gloved hand into the soapy water. She turned off the faucet. The sudden quiet was violently oppressive. Slowly she turned to face him, the polite, flawless mask cracking to reveal a hardened, defensive edge. "I don't know what kind of midlife crisis you're projecting onto me right now," Evelyn said, her tone dripping with a dangerous, icy calm. "But I work 60 hours a week to build a life for us. For Lily. If you have a problem with my hours, say it. Don't play these passive-aggressive parlor games in front of our friends." It was a masterful deflection, a brilliant display of manipulation that would have made him apologize and back down just a week ago. Matthew didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply pulled his right hand out of his pocket. He stepped forward and dropped the heavy, unmarked golden key onto the white marble island. The brass hit the stone with a sharp, brutal clack. It sounded like a gunshot in the sterile, perfectly curated kitchen. Evelyn's eyes dropped to the key. All the color drained from her face in an instant, leaving her skin the pale shade of ash. Her breath hitched, a sharp, involuntary intake of air that betrayed the absolute collapse of her defenses. She stared at the metal object as if it were a venomous snake coiled on their countertop. "I didn't play a parlor game, Evelyn," Matthew said, his voice dropping to a hollow, broken whisper. "I played the game you've been playing for 7 years. Only I found the cheat code." She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The brilliant, articulate executive was suddenly rendered mute, her eyes darting frantically as she searched for a lie that could cover the damning weight of the brass key. $4,000 a month, Matthew continued, stepping into her personal space, refusing to let her look away. "Unit 1402, the Meridian. I stood in the rain, Evelyn. I watched you walk into the garage. I watched him touch you like he owned you. I watched you look at him in a way you haven't looked at me since the day we met." Evelyn leaned back against the sink, her hands gripping the granite edge so hard her knuckles turned white, as the magnificent, elaborate fortress of her lies finally came crashing down around them. The silence in the kitchen stretched, pulled taut like a piano wire about to snap. Evelyn stared at the brass key, the physical anchor of her secondary existence now lying exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of her primary one. Matthew watched the frantic calculations behind her eyes slow down, falter, and finally cease. The brilliant executive problem solver vanished. What remained was a woman utterly exhausted by the weight of her own architecture. She didn't cry. That was the first thing that struck him. There were no hysterics, no desperate pleas for forgiveness, no frantic denials. Instead, Evelyn let her head fall back against the subway tile. A long, shuddering breath escaped her lips, a sigh that sounded disturbingly like relief. "You went to the Meridian," she whispered, her voice devoid of its usual polished cadence. It sounded hollow, scraped clean. "You stood in the rain." "I watched him hold you," Matthew corrected, his tone merciless, refusing to let her soften the edges of the reality. "I watched him unlock the door to the life you bought with $4,000 a month. So tell me, Evelyn. Tell me it meant nothing. Tell me it was just a mistake." Evelyn slowly pushed herself away from the sink. She looked at Matthew, her eyes dark, bottomless wells of an emotion he couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't pity. It was a terrifying, desolate honesty. "I can't tell you that, Matt," she said softly. She reached out and touched the cold metal of the key, tracing its jagged teeth with her index finger. "Because it wouldn't just be a lie, it would be an insult to both of us." "Then what is it?" Matthew demanded, his voice finally cracking, the raw agony bleeding through his composed facade. "A midlife crisis? A thrill? Who the hell is Derek Stone?" Evelyn closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the last remaining veil between them tore away. "He isn't a crisis, Matthew, and he isn't new." She paused, swallowing hard against the dryness in her throat. "Derek was there before I ever walked into that jazz bar. He was there before I ever knew your name." The words hit Matthew with the concussive force of a physical blow. He stumbled back half a step, the air rushing out of his lungs. "What? The bad breakup I told you about when we met?" Evelyn's voice trembled now, not with guilt, but with the terrifying vulnerability of a confession held back for a decade. "It wasn't a breakup. It was a breakdown. Derek and I, we are poison to each other. We are a forest fire. We burn through money, jobs, our own sanity. I left him because if I had stayed, we would have destroyed each other completely." She stepped toward Matthew, her hands trembling. "Then I met you. You were so good, Matt, so solid. You were the safe harbor. I thought if I married you, if I built a normal, quiet life, a house, a daughter, PTA meetings, I could become that person. I thought I could cure myself of him by pretending to be someone who deserved you." "A cure," Matthew repeated, the word tasting like ash. The room began to spin slightly. "I was a cure, a rehabilitation center. You were my salvation," she choked out, a single tear finally breaching the dam and tracing a line through her makeup. "But you can't cure what's in your blood. 2 years into our marriage, he moved to Seattle. He found me. And God forgive me, Matt. I didn't want to run anymore. I needed the fire just as much as I needed the harbor." Matthew looked at the woman he had loved, had protected, had built an entire universe around. The horrific magnitude of her deception settled over him like a suffocating shroud. She hadn't replaced him with Derek. He had merely been a temporary, socially acceptable understudy for a role he was never meant to permanently fill. The 7 years of their marriage weren't a life. They were an intermission. "You didn't build a life with me, Evelyn," Matthew said, his voice dropping to a dead, mechanical whisper. "You built a hiding place." The dawn crept into the Oakwood Estates house, not with light, but with a sickly, bruised gray that perfectly mirrored the hollow cavern in Matthew's chest. He had not moved from the living room armchair since Evelyn retreated to the guest bedroom upstairs hours ago. The golden key remained on the kitchen island, a heavy brass gravestone marking the death of his 7-year illusion. He stared at the framed photographs lining the mantel. There was their wedding day in Napa. Evelyn smiling brightly under a canopy of white roses. There was Lily's first birthday. Evelyn's hands gently supporting the toddler as she smashed her fists into a pink cake. Before last night, these were the milestones of a successful, loving life. Now they looked like props on a meticulously designed movie set. He wasn't looking at cherished memories. He was looking at the alibis of a woman desperate to prove to the world, and to herself, that she could be normal. The sound of small, rapid footsteps on the hardwood floor upstairs broke the suffocating silence. It was Sunday morning. Lily was awake. Matthew stood up, his joints aching as if he had aged a decade overnight. He walked to the bottom of the staircase just as his 6-year-old daughter appeared at the landing, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. "Daddy, you're up early." She rubbed her eyes, her blonde hair, so much like her mother's, tousled from sleep. The physical pain that ripped through Matthew at the sight of her was blinding. He climbed the stairs and scooped her into his arms, burying his face in her small, warm shoulder. She smelled of baby shampoo and innocence. If Evelyn had never needed a safe harbor from the chaotic storm of Derek Stone, Lily would not exist. His greatest joy was the direct, beautiful byproduct of the most devastating deception of his life. "I'm just making sure the house is safe, Bug," Matthew whispered, his voice dangerously thick. He closed his eyes, forcing the tears back into his throat. He could not break down. Not here. Not in front of her. As he carried Lily down to the kitchen, the guest room door opened. Evelyn stepped out. She was wearing a faded college sweatshirt and sweatpants. Her face completely devoid of makeup, her eyes swollen and ringed with dark purple exhaustion. She looked at Matthew, holding their daughter, and for a fleeting second, the sheer, crushing tragedy of what they had lost hung heavy in the air between them. "Morning, Mommy," Lily chirped, blissfully oblivious to the fact that she was the only thing keeping the roof from caving in on them. "Good morning, sweetheart," Evelyn managed to say, her voice cracking slightly. She walked past them, her gaze carefully avoiding Matthew's, and moved to the kitchen island. She picked up the golden key, slipping it silently into her pocket before pulling a carton of milk from the fridge. The routine of Sunday morning breakfast began. Pancakes were flipped, juice was poured, the television played a cheerful cartoon in the background. It was an agonizing, grotesque pantomime of domesticity. Matthew sat at the table, watching Evelyn meticulously cut Lily's pancakes into bite-sized squares. His ego, once anchored in the steadfast belief that he was a good man who had built a beautiful family, had been annihilated. He wasn't an equal partner. He was a human shield. He was the boring, stable mortgage. He was the predictable PTA meeting. He was the necessary grounding wire that allowed Evelyn to safely channel the high-voltage electricity of her true, destructive love affair without burning her own life down. He looked at his daughter, laughing at the bright colors on the screen, and then at his wife, staring blankly out the window into the relentless Seattle rain. The dilemma was agonizingly clear, yet impossible to resolve cleanly. To tear this house down meant crushing Lily beneath the rubble, but to stay meant suffocating slowly in the airtight vacuum of a counterfeit life. He was trapped in the wreckage, and he knew the only way out was to finally set the illusion on fire. The rain had returned by Monday evening, a relentless, freezing drizzle that slicked the pavement outside Matthew's law firm. He walked out of the glass lobby, his briefcase feeling like an anvil in his hand. He hadn't slept in 2 days. The protective numbness had worn off, leaving behind a raw, agonizing clarity. As he approached his parked sedan in the dimly lit garage, a figure stepped out from the shadows of a concrete pillar. Matthew stopped. The air in his lungs turned to ice. Derek Stone was wearing a tailored charcoal suit, perfectly at ease in the damp, echoing space. He didn't look like a man caught in an affair. He looked like a landlord coming to collect a debt. The scent of cedar and bergamot drifted through the damp air, instantly triggering a visceral wave of nausea in Matthew's stomach. "Matthew," Derek said. His voice was smooth, a low baritone completely devoid of guilt or apprehension. "Stone," Matthew replied, his knuckles turning white around the handle of his briefcase. Every primal instinct screamed at him to drop the bag and swing, to shatter the arrogant calmness on Derek's face. But violence would only prove that Derek had taken something that belonged to Matthew. And they both knew the tragic truth. Evelyn had never belonged to him in the first place. "I didn't come here to antagonize you," Derek said, stepping into the pale yellow light of an overhead bulb. "I came because Evelyn is tearing herself apart. She's paralyzed by the guilt of what she's doing to your daughter, and she won't make the call. So I'm making it." "You're making it," Matthew repeated, a bitter, hollow laugh escaping his lips. "You think you get a vote in my marriage?" "It hasn't been a marriage for years, Matthew. It's been a waiting room," Derek said, his gaze unflinching. There was a strange, twisted pity in his eyes. "I know she told you about us. I know you think I ruined your life. But the truth is, We tried to stay away from each other. You were a good attempt, Matthew. You gave her the illusion of peace, but you can't domesticate a wildfire. Before Matthew could respond, the screech of tires echoed through the concrete structure. Evelyn's silver Volvo took the corner entirely too fast, slamming on the brakes a few yards away. She threw the door open and practically fell out of the car. She looked frantic, her trench coat unbelted, her hair damp from the rain. "Derek, what the hell are you doing?" she shouted, running toward them. She placed herself between the two men, looking wildly from her husband to her lover. "I'm ending the delay, Evie," Derek said softly, reaching out to touch her arm. Matthew watched her. He watched how her body instinctively leaned into Derek's touch before she caught herself and pulled away. It was a microscopic movement, but it contained the entire tragedy of their 7 years together. "It stops tonight, Evelyn," Matthew said. His voice wasn't angry, it was dead. The exhaustion had finally conquered the grief. "No more double lives, no more compartmentalization. You don't get to come home to Lily and me to wash off the guilt and then run back to Unit 1402 when the suburbs get too quiet." Evelyn stared at him, tears welling in her eyes, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Matt, please." "Make a choice," Matthew demanded, the finality of the words echoing off the concrete walls. "If you get in my car right now, you never see him again. You change your number. You sell the lease. We spend the rest of our lives trying to fix this for our daughter. But if you get in his car, you don't come back to Oakwood Estates. Ever." Evelyn stood frozen in the damp garage. She looked at Matthew, the man who had given her a beautiful, safe, perfect life. Then she looked at Derek, the man who was the poison in her veins. She closed her eyes, the tears spilling over her lashes, her shoulders shaking with the weight of a decision she had been delaying for a decade. She opened her eyes. She didn't look at Matthew. She took a slow, agonizing step toward the man in the charcoal suit. The bedroom of the Oakwood Estates house, usually a sanctuary of muted tones and soft linens, had been transformed into a sterile staging area for a departure. 2 large leather suitcases lay open on the California king bed, their cavernous depths slowly filling with the remnants of Evelyn's primary life. Matthew sat in the velvet armchair by the window, the same spot where he had waited in the dark just 4 nights ago. The rain had finally stopped, leaving a heavy, suffocating stillness in its wake. He watched his wife fold a cashmere sweater, a Christmas gift from his mother, and place it meticulously beside a stack of silk blouses. Her movements were mechanical, devoid of the frantic energy she had displayed in the parking garage. She was operating on autopilot, dismantling their 7 years together piece by piece. "You don't have to take everything tonight," Matthew said, his voice a dry, raspy scrape in the quiet room. "Lily will be confused enough in the morning. I don't want her waking up to an empty closet." Evelyn paused, her hands resting flat against the folded clothes. Her shoulders slumped forward, the weight of his words pressing down on her fragile posture. "I know. I'll just take enough for a few weeks, until we figure out how to tell her." "How to tell her," Matthew repeated, the phrase tasting like bile. "How do you explain to a 6-year-old that her mother is leaving the safe harbor to go burn in a wildfire?" Evelyn turned to face him. Her eyes were red-rimmed and completely hollowed out. The polished executive, the perfect suburban wife, all the masks had been stripped away, leaving only a profoundly broken woman who was finally facing the mirror. "You think I want this, Matt?" she whispered, her voice cracking under the strain. "You think I want to destroy her world? Or yours?" "I think you made a choice in that garage," Matthew replied, his gaze unwavering. "A choice you've been making every day since you rented that apartment." Evelyn walked over to the edge of the bed and sat down, the mattress sinking beneath her weight. She looked down at her hands, twisting the plain gold wedding band on her left ring finger. It was the only piece of jewelry she hadn't taken off. "When I met you," she began, her voice trembling, "I was drowning. Derek and we are an addiction, a sickness. I walked away from him because I wanted to survive. And then I found you. You were so kind, so steady. I thought if I built a life with you, if I played the part perfectly, the sickness would eventually leave my system." She looked up, a solitary tear escaping and tracing a slow path down her pale cheek. "But love doesn't cure an addiction, Matt. It just masks it. I stayed in this lie because I desperately wanted it to be my truth. I love the life we built. I love the man you are, but every time the house got too quiet, every time I looked at our perfect suburban existence, I felt like I couldn't breathe. Matthew absorbed the devastating honesty of her confession. It was the cruelest paradox he had ever encountered. She hadn't stayed to maliciously use him. She had stayed because she was trying to save herself. But in her desperate attempt to survive, she had pulled him under the waves with her. "So you rented a room at the Meridian," Matthew said softly, "to catch your breath." "To survive," she corrected, her voice dropping to an agonizing whisper. "I'm so sorry, Matt. You deserved a husband who was whole, a partner, not someone who needed two lives just to exist." Matthew stood up from the armchair. He didn't feel anger anymore. The rage had burned out, leaving nothing but a vast, desolate landscape of acceptance. He walked over to the bed, reaching out to gently take her left hand. With slow, deliberate movements, he slid the gold wedding band off her finger. Evelyn let out a choked sob as the metal slipped away, breaking the final physical tether between them. "Go pack your bags, Evelyn," Matthew said, placing the ring on the nightstand. The sharp clink of the gold hitting the glass top sounded like the final tolling of a bell. "I'll tell Lily you had an early flight for a business trip. We'll deal with the rest tomorrow." He turned and walked out of the bedroom, leaving her alone with the open suitcases and the shattered remnants of a beautiful, tragic lie. 6 months had passed since the night the golden key shattered the foundation of Oakwood Estates. The relentless Seattle winter had bled into a damp, gray spring. Matthew sat in the sterile, glass-walled conference room of a downtown mediation firm, the hum of the city traffic muffled by thick, soundproof windows. Across the expansive mahogany table sat Evelyn. She looked remarkably different. The polished, meticulously curated armor of the corporate executive and suburban mother had been stripped away. She wore a simple black sweater, her hair pulled back loosely, the dark circles under her eyes speaking of a life that was now entirely authentic, yet undeniably exhausting. The wildfire was no longer hidden, and it was clearly burning her, just as she had predicted. But there was no regret in her posture, only a quiet, heavy resignation. Between them lay a thick stack of legal documents: the divorce decree. The mediator, a soft-spoken woman with a gentle demeanor, walked them through the final stipulations. Joint custody of Lily, with primary residence remaining at the Oakwood Estates house, so the 6-year-old wouldn't have to change schools or lose her bedroom. A clean, uncontested division of assets. Evelyn would retain her private accounts and the lease at the Meridian. The legal jargon was cold and clinical, systematically reducing a 7-year marriage to a series of bullet points, asset columns, and visitation schedules. "If you both agree to these terms, we just need your signatures on the last page," the mediator said softly, sliding the document toward Evelyn and placing a heavy silver pen beside it. Evelyn stared at the paper. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the pen. The scratching of the nib against the thick parchment sounded deafening in the quiet room. She didn't hesitate, but her movements were slow, almost reverent. When she finished, she pushed the document across the polished wood toward Matthew. Matthew looked down at the dotted line. Above it was the name of the woman he had sworn to protect, the woman he thought he had rescued from a painful past. He picked up the pen. It felt infinitely heavier than the brass key he had dropped on their kitchen counter months ago. He thought about their wedding day in the sunlit vineyards. He thought about the lingering smell of jasmine in their hallway. He thought about the illusion of a family he had fought so desperately to keep alive. The grief swelled in his chest, not a violent, angry wave, but a deep, mournful tide of acceptance. A single tear escaped his eye, dropping silently onto the crisp white paper, slightly blurring the blue ink of the word petitioner. He pressed the pen down and signed his name, severing the legal bond, setting the ghost free. The mediator gathered the papers, offering a polite, sympathetic nod before stepping out of the room to make copies. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving Matthew and Evelyn alone in the quiet, sterile room for the final time. Evelyn looked at him, her own eyes now shining with unshed tears. The silence between them was no longer suffocating. It was just empty. "Matt," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the moment, "I am so sorry for everything I broke, for everything I took from you." Matthew looked at the empty space on the table where the papers had been. He didn't feel the crushing betrayal anymore. He felt a profound, bittersweet peace. The suffocating weight of the lie had been lifted. He was finally standing on solid ground, facing reality exactly as it was, even if he was standing alone. He met her gaze, his expression calm, filled with a quiet, devastating clarity. "You don't have to apologize for breaking us," Matthew said softly, his voice steady and resolute. "I didn't lose you to him, Evelyn. I never really had you in the first place.